2 years before that October afternoon, Rhonda had pointed at Willa's stomach and said the baby probably wasn't even Garrett's. 2 years before that, Garrett had believed her. Now Rhonda was standing at the entrance of the Maple Street daycare in Guelph, her hand already reaching out toward Leo, and Willa had gotten the call from the front desk before she'd even made it out of the parking lot at work. She drove back in 4 minutes. Willa pushed through the glass door and saw her son standing in the foyer with his backpack on, looking uncertain. He was 2.5. He didn't know this woman who was crouching in front of him with her hand extended. He looked toward Willa's as soon as she walked in, and his whole face changed. "Mama." Willa went to him first. She picked him up and held him against her shoulder, then turned to face Rhonda. It had been 2 years since she'd last seen Garrett's mother up close. Rhonda was wearing a belted coat in a shade of deep burgundy, her hair set neatly as always, gold earrings catching the afternoon light. She looked the same. She probably assumed Willa looked worse. Willa didn't look worse. "He's the image of Garrett at that age," Rhonda said. Her voice was quieter than Willa expected. Not soft exactly, more like something rehearsed. "You need to leave," Willa said. "I just want." "You need to leave." Willa looked at the young woman behind the desk, who was already watching with her hand near the phone. "She's not on Leo's authorized pickup list. She's not on any list. Please make note of that." "Of course," the woman said. Rhonda's jaw tightened. "He's my grandson." Willa shifted Leo on her hip. He had wrapped one arm around her neck and pressed his face into her collar, the way he always did when he was unsure of something. She could feel his small breath against her skin. "When I was 7 months pregnant," Willa said, keeping her voice even, "you sat across from me at your kitchen table and told your son the baby might belong to someone else. You said it with so much certainty that he believed you. You know what you did, Rhonda. Don't stand here in front of strangers and call him your grandson." She walked out. Rhonda didn't follow. Willa had grown up in a narrow row house on the east side of Guelph with her mother, Colette. Just the two of them. Colette worked as a seamstress out of the back room, taking in alterations and occasionally making wedding gowns for brides who wanted something custom, but couldn't afford the boutiques downtown. She was precise and careful about everything. Her stitches, her finances, her words. She had raised Willa the same way. They didn't have much, but Willa had never felt the lack of it growing up. Colette made soup from scratch on Sunday evenings, kept the small front garden tidy through the summer, and always had library books stacked by the armchair near the window. She had never remarried after Willa's father left when Willa was 3. She didn't talk about him often. When she did, it was without bitterness. He made his choice, she'd say. We made ours. Willa studied early childhood education at the University of Guelph, worked part-time at a cafe on Stone Road, and came home most weekends to have dinner with Colette. She was 26 when she met Garrett. He came into the cafe on a rainy April morning and ordered a large coffee and a blueberry scone. And when he reached for sugar at the same moment Willa was wiping down the condiment station, he apologized so genuinely that she laughed. He was tall, with a quiet way of holding himself, and he came back the next 3 mornings in a row before finally asking if she'd like to get dinner sometime. She liked him. He was thoughtful and a little serious, the kind of person who remembered things you'd mentioned in passing. He brought Colette flowers the first time she invited him over for supper. He didn't try to impress anyone. He just showed up, consistently for almost 2 years, until it felt like he'd always been there. Colette was warm toward him, but she was also cautious in the way that mothers become cautious when they've done everything alone for a long time. She would sit across from him at the table and ask him things that weren't quite questions. "Your mother raised you herself," she said once, passing him the bread. That must have been hard on her. Garrett had said yes, it was. Colette had nodded and said nothing else. She told Willa later, "A man shaped by one strong woman either grows into someone who respects all women or someone who can only follow one." Willa hadn't entirely understood that then. Rhonda lived in a large house in Puzzlinch, about 15 minutes outside the city. She'd built the life she had through her ex-husband's settlement and her own considerable will. She owned 2 rental properties and spent her weekends at the Legion or the Garden Club, and she had very specific ideas about what kind of woman her son should marry. Willa was not that woman. When Garrett first brought her out to meet Rhonda, Willa had dressed carefully. Not too formal, not too casual, a pale blue blouse Colette had pressed for her that morning. She brought a potted rosemary plant because she'd heard Rhonda kept an herb garden. She had tried. Rhonda opened the door, looked at Willa, looked at the plant and said, "You didn't need to bring anything." She said it on the porch railing without taking it inside. Over dinner, Rhonda talked mostly to Garrett. When she addressed Willa, it was with questions that felt like small examinations. What did her mother do for work? Did they own or rent? Was her father in the picture at all? Willa answered everything calmly. She had grown up knowing what it felt like to be assessed and found lacking before anyone had actually looked. In the car home, Garrett said his mother just needed time to warm up. Willa looked out the window at the dark fields going past. "I know," she said. She just wasn't sure time was going to be enough. They got engaged the following spring. Garrett took her to Elora Gorge and proposed at the edge of the water with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother. And Willa said yes with her hands shaking. When they went to tell Rhonda, she said, "Well, you've made your decision." She poured tea and talked about the weather. The wedding was small, Rhonda's idea. She said big weddings were wasteful, and Willa, who had never imagined a large wedding anyway, agreed quickly. She wanted peace more than ceremony. Colette made the dress herself, ivory cotton with small covered buttons down the back, simple and beautiful. She had worked on it for 3 months, without saying a word until it was finished. Willa wore it. It was perfect. Moving into Garrett's house, the house he shared with Rhonda, because Rhonda had asked him to stay close after a health scare 2 years earlier, was harder than Willa had let herself prepare for. The house had a rhythm already, and it was Rhonda's rhythm. Rhonda decided when meals happened and how. Rhonda controlled the thermostat. Rhonda left carefully calibrated comments about dust on the baseboards and whether the towels in the bathroom were folded the right way. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. She had 30 years of practice making her preferences feel like law. Garrett tried. When Rhonda made a pointed remark about the way Willa loaded the dishwasher, Garrett said something. When Rhonda told a neighbor over coffee that Garrett had always wanted a woman with more ambition, Garrett, who'd overheard from the hallway, told his mother that was unnecessary. Rhonda looked at him with mild surprise, as though she couldn't imagine what the fuss was about, and changed the subject. Willa learned to hold her reactions until she was alone in their room. She'd sit on the edge of the bed and breathe for a while, and then she'd get up and keep going. Colette had taught her that. You don't fall apart in front of people who are waiting for it. Then Rhonda's friend Lacey started appearing. Lacey was 41, recently returned from Vancouver, easy in the way of someone who had always moved through rooms without having to work for attention. She and Garrett had dated briefly years ago. A few months, according to Garrett, nothing serious. Rhonda began inviting her over for dinner, then for weekend lunches. Then Lacey started appearing just to drop things off and staying for 2 hours. Willa said once carefully that it felt uncomfortable having someone with that history in the house so regularly. Rhonda said Lacey was like a daughter to her. And what was Willa suggesting, exactly? Garrett said nothing. Willa noticed that, the particular shape of his silence. There was a tenant in the detached suite behind the property, a man named Finn, who worked at the hospital as a physiotherapist. Rhonda had rented the space to him 6 months before Willa arrived. He was quiet and kept to himself mostly, but when they crossed paths, he was always easy and direct in the way Willa had come to appreciate, after so many months of layered conversations with Rhonda. He asked after Colette when he knew Willa had been visiting. He fixed the gate latch one afternoon without being asked. When Willa was clearly having a difficult day, he didn't press, just said, "Rough one?" and accepted whatever brief answer she gave. Rhonda didn't like their friendliness. She made comments that implied things without stating them outright. Willa understood the game. She didn't take the bait. By the time Willa was 7 months pregnant, she had learned to move through that house, like someone carrying something fragile, always careful, always a little braced. It was a Wednesday afternoon in March. Garrett was in Toronto for 2 nights, a work conference. Willa had been home organizing things in the spare room they were converting into a nursery. She was tired in the slow, heavy way of late pregnancy, and when Rhonda brought her a mug of chamomile tea and said, almost gently, "You should rest. You've been on your feet all day," Willa had taken it without thinking. She woke up on the bed without knowing she'd lain down. The room was shadowed. It was later than it should have been. She heard Rhonda's voice first, louder than usual, coming from downstairs, then another voice, then footsteps on the stairs. Garrett was standing in the bedroom doorway when Willa opened her eyes. His face was completely wrong. Behind him, Rhonda was saying something about how long she'd had her suspicions, and on the far side of the bed, Finn was sitting up, confused and blinking, pressing his hand to his face like someone trying to wake himself out of something. "Garrett," Willa started. "Don't." He was white around the mouth. "Just don't." Finn was already saying there had been a misunderstanding, that he didn't know how he'd ended up there, that someone must have arranged this. Rhonda talked over him. Garrett didn't look at either of them the way someone looks when they're genuinely trying to understand. He looked at Willa the way someone looks when they've already decided. She had felt that look forming for months, not because of anything she'd done, because it had been building in him slowly, fed by small comments and manufactured doubts, by a woman who had never wanted Willa in this house and had finally found her angle. "Garrett, listen to me. I drank the tea your mother brought me and I don't remember lying down. This was arranged. You know who I am. You know I would never." He stepped toward her and she stopped talking. What happened next happened fast and slowly at the same time, the way certain things do when your body can't process them in the right order. She remembered reaching for the wall. She remembered Finn's voice raised behind her, furious in a way she hadn't heard from him before. She remembered being on the floor with her hands over her stomach, saying, "Please, the baby, please just stop." Garrett stopped. He looked at her on the floor. Something crossed his face that might have been horror. Then he stepped back. Rhonda appeared in the doorway. "I think you'd better pack a bag," she said to Willa. Her voice was perfectly calm. Finn drove her to the hospital. He barely spoke the whole way, his hands tight on the steering wheel, and when they arrived, he stayed in the waiting area until Colette got there. And then he stayed 2 hours more, until someone came out to tell them both that Willa and the baby were stable. Colette held her daughter's hand and said nothing for a long time. Then, "You don't have to protect him." "I'm not protecting him," Willa said. "I'm protecting myself. I'm not giving anyone a reason to make this messier than it already is." She paused. "I filed a report at the admissions desk. It's on record, that's enough for now." Colette pressed her lips together. She didn't agree, but she understood her daughter. 3 days later, Garrett showed up at Colette's house with papers in an envelope. He hadn't called ahead. He stood in the doorway in his work coat, and when Willa came to the door, he couldn't quite meet her eyes. "My mother's lawyer put these together," he said. Willa took the envelope. She didn't open it in front of him. "Is there anything else?" He was quiet for a moment. "The baby. Isn't something you get to ask about right now," she said. She closed the door. She stood in the hallway with the envelope in her hands. From the kitchen she could hear Colette moving around, the sound of a pot on the stove. She put the papers on the side table and went to help with dinner. She signed the divorce papers 2 weeks later. She made it plain she would not be making any claim on Garrett's property. She made it equally plain that any challenges to the baby's paternity would be answered with the medical documentation she was already collecting, that she intended to pursue child support through the proper channels the moment Leo's was born, and that she would be keeping records of everything from that point forward. Rhonda, through the lawyer, put in writing that the child's paternity was uncertain. Willa kept that letter in a folder with everything else. Leo arrived in June, healthy and loud and absolutely unmistakable. He had Garrett's forehead. He had the shape of Garrett's eyes. He had a particular way of furrowing his brow when he was concentrating that Colette noticed immediately. "That's Garrett to the life," she said, and then she kissed Leo on the top of his head and said no more about it. Willa held him that first night, in the quiet of the hospital room, while Colette slept in the chair by the window, and she counted his fingers twice and looked at his face for a long time. "We're going to be fine," she told him. She meant it. She had been saying it for months, and somewhere in the repetition it had quietly become true. Finn came by the next morning with a bunch of yellow tulips and a card signed from him and his entire department, which made Willa laugh. He stood in the doorway looking slightly at a loss until she told him he could come in and sit down. He did, and he stayed for nearly an hour, talking to Leo very seriously about the general nature of the world, while Colette pretended to read her magazine and smiled at the ceiling. The month settled into something Willa hadn't quite expected: ordinary happiness, not dramatic, not triumphant, just the daily particular goodness of her small life. Leo on a blanket in the backyard, Colette reading to him in the evenings, Willa going back to work part-time, then full-time, the colleagues she liked, the problems she knew how to solve. Finn had moved into a place nearer the hospital, but still came by regularly. He brought Leo picture books. He started coming for Sunday dinners often enough that Colette eventually just set his place at the table without asking. He and Willa had reached that stage of friendship where they could disagree directly and then have tea and move on, which Willa had come to understand was its own form of trust. She wasn't ready to call it anything else yet. She'd told him that plainly one evening when he'd tried to tell her how he felt. He'd nodded and said he understood. He kept showing up anyway. She noticed that he kept showing up anyway, and she filed that away somewhere careful. 2 years after Leo was born, Rhonda started driving slowly past Colette's street. Colette noticed first, the way she noticed most things, without alarm, stated simply. "That burgundy sedan went by again," she said, setting down her tea. "Third time this week." Willa already knew. She had been half expecting something like this. Leo was 2 now, walking and talking, and all the things that make a child undeniably real to people who had tried to pretend he didn't exist. Rhonda had no grandchildren. Garrett's second attempt at a relationship had ended badly, from what moved through mutual acquaintances. And Leo looked exactly like his father, in the way of a fact that couldn't be argued with. The daycare incident was the first move. A week later, Garrett left a voicemail. She didn't answer. She listened to the message twice and then called her lawyer. His voice in the message was shorter and quieter than she'd expected. Just his name, a pause, and then, "I think we should talk. I found something out. I owe you a conversation. I understand if you don't want to have it." She eventually agreed to a brief meeting at a coffee shop on Wyndham Street. Her lawyer knew she was going. She kept it to 45 minutes. What she learned was this. Lacey had been borrowing money from Rhonda over the preceding 2 years. Significant money presented to Garrett as investments Rhonda had made on Lacey's advice. Lacey had also at some point gotten Rhonda to sign paperwork related to one of the rental properties. Paperwork Rhonda hadn't read carefully enough. By the time Garrett understood the full picture, Lacey had transferred what she could, made arrangements on the property through a legal structure that would take time to untangle, and disappeared somewhere south of the border. And then Lacey, apparently, had sent Garrett a message before she left. A few lines. She told him what she and Rhonda had done the afternoon they'd found Finn in Willa's room. She told him the chamomile tea had been tampered with. She told him there were photos on Rhonda's phone from that afternoon that she herself had helped take. She told him Willa had never done a single thing wrong. Garrett sat across from Willa in the coffee shop and told her all of this without looking away. He was thinner than she remembered. He looked tired in a way that went past sleep. "I'm not telling you this to ask for anything," he said. "I know it's too late for that. I just needed you to hear that I know the truth now." Willa wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "The truth was always the truth," she said. "You knew me, Garrett. You chose not to believe me. Those aren't the same thing as not knowing." He nodded. He didn't argue. She respected that a little. "Leo?" he asked after a moment. "Has 2 people at home who love him," she said. "If you want to be part of his life, that's a conversation for lawyers and a process I'm willing to begin. But it doesn't start with Rhonda anywhere near him." Garrett looked down at the table. "That's fair." "It's not about fair," Willa said. "It's about what Leo needs." She left first. She told Finn about the conversation that evening. They were sitting on Colette's back porch after Leo had gone to sleep, the October air cool and sharp and smelling faintly of fallen leaves, and Finn listened without interrupting the way he always did. When she finished, he said, "How do you feel?" "Lighter," she said. She thought about it more. Like something I'd been carrying a long time just put itself down. He looked at her for a moment. "Good." Colette came to the door and said there was tea, and they both went inside. Later, when Finn was getting his coat to leave, Willa said, "You've been here a lot." "I know," he said. "I'm not saying that as a complaint," she said. He waited. "I'm saying I've noticed," she said, "and I think I'd like you to keep being here." He looked at her the way she had come to trust. Directly, without performing anything, without filling the silence with reassurance it didn't need. "Okay," he said, "I can do that." Rhonda showed up at the daycare one more time. 3 weeks later on a Thursday afternoon, Willa got the call, drove over, and this time she brought a letter from her lawyer outlining precisely and clearly what the consequences would be if Rhonda attempted unsanctioned contact with Leo outside of a court-authorized arrangement. Rhonda stood outside the daycare door and read it. She looked older standing there in the November light. Not diminished. Rhonda was not a woman who diminished easily. but reduced, like someone who had spent a great deal of energy building walls and had only now come around to see what was waiting on the other side of them. He looks like Garrett, Rhonda said again, almost to herself. He looks like himself, Willa said. That's all he needs to look like. She went inside and got her son. Leo was wearing a paper crown he'd made in craft time, orange and yellow, slightly crooked. He held it on his head with one hand as she carried him to the car, the other arm warm around her neck. Mama, I made a crown, he informed her very seriously. I can see that, she said. It's very good. It's for you, he said and placed it on her head. She drove home. The crown slid to one side, she left it there. Colette had dinner started when they got in. Something with lentils that smelled of cumin and warmth, and Leo ran to her shouting grandma with the full force of a 2-year-old, who had not yet learned that anything good should be moderated. Colette caught him and lifted him and said, my darling, my darling, my darling, the way she had said it since the day he was born. Willa hung up her coat and washed her hands and set the table for 4, and when the door opened and Finn came in knocking the cold off his boots, Leo launched himself across the room and Finn caught him and said, hey buddy, how was your day? And Leo told him, at length, with gestures, about the crown. Willa stood in the kitchen doorway watching all of them, and she felt something that wasn't relief exactly. Because nothing about life ever felt entirely finished. But she felt the full weight of what she had protected, and kept and held on to through everything. And she understood, standing there with a paper crown tilted sideways on her head, that it had been worth it. Every single difficult day of it had been worth it.